Hi guys, welcome to our podcast.
Hi.
Hi.
Hmm. I want to go somewhere. Let's go on a trip.
Yeah, I'd like to. Where?
Hmm. How about Japan? Traveling to Japan is going around.
Have you guys heard that recently Korea and Japan discussed about allowing people to travel between them without a passport?
Wait, is it possible? We've been invaded by Japan more than 700 times. How could we get along so well with them?
Do you really think we are on good terms? There are still unsolved historical issues, territorial disputes, and other controversies. However, they make diplomatic decisions for national interests.
So, having a good relationship is apart from having a system that allows people to come and go without a passport, right?
Yeah, that's it. They think it's good diplomatic move.
So today, we're gonna talk about one of the most controversial topics about one of the oldest historical issues between Korea and Japan. The forced labor of the Japanese military's comfort women.
Is it about the history of sex slaves in the Japanese colonial period, right?
Right, but before that, we need to call them comfort women. Sexual assault is a more appropriate term than sexual slavery. In fact, comfort women is an incorrect expression as a means to comfort Japanese soldiers to relieve sexual desire. For this reason, we must use quotation marks when using the expression comfort women.
I understand that the usage of comfort women is one of the sex crimes of Japan targeting colonial Korean women. I saw the news recently that handled the judgment about the lawsuit for damages of victims targeting the Japanese government. And it has been talked about a lot, but it's not resolved yet.
Yeah, I felt sad when I saw the news. Historical justice was not served.
It's a pretty sensitive and controversial historical topic between Korea and Japan about whether or not it's been fully resolved.
However, as I know, compensation has already been made under the Treaty of 1965 during the Park Chung-hee government, isn't it?
But actually, the context of the Treaty of 65 is very controversial nowadays. I think we can continue the discussion with the legal interpretation of this treaty.
So today we're gonna talk about whether or not we should continue to demand compensation from the Japanese government for the forced labor of comfort women. Let's begin.
We need to talk about the Treaty of 1965, right?
Yeah, but before that, let's start with the Treaty of San Francisco, which is the background to the Treaty of 1965. This treaty was between the Allies and Japan for handling damages after World War II. Representatives from 48 nations, including the United States, met in San Francisco and signed a number of important treaties.
Which ones?
The treaty was to end the state of war between Japan and the Allies, recognize Japanese sovereignty, liberate Japanese colonies, and compensate for damages.
On the issues of claims, the Allies decided that Japan should compensate for being a war criminal. But since Japan had just ended the war and was short on resources, they should negotiate with the countries they harmed. However, Korea was not included in the treaty, making process or negotiations.
That's why the Treaty of 1965 was signed.
Right. Korea and Japan signed basic treaties about their relationship in order to normalize diplomatic relations. It was agreed to recognize the government of the Republic of Korea as the sole government on the Korean peninsula, confirm that all treaties signed in the Japanese colonial period were invalid, and establish diplomatic and consular relations.
Those treaties include settlement of the right to claim.
Right to claim? What was it exactly about?
More specifically, Korea and Japan made an agreement about the right to claim to increase economic cooperation and to resolve the problems of the property of both countries' people and the right to claim.
Japan was required to compensate $3 billion to the government of Korea over 10 years under the settlement.
But the compensation was never given directly to the victims, right?
Legally, we can say that the compensation was given to the government. However, the victims claimed that they wanted personal compensation.
We cannot come to a certain conclusion that states whether or not the victims have the right to demand compensation directly from the Japanese government. This is because the agreement only mentioned property and claims, and it didn't mention anything about the reparation for illegal acts, including the usage of comfort women.
Why did they make such ambiguous terms in the first place?
They are all for political reasons. Back then, Korea needed diplomatic cooperation with Japan, and Japan's support was essential. However, addressing historical issues was premature, considering it had only been 20 years since the end of the war.
In fact, many people at the time voiced opposition to the Korea-Japan agreement, sparkling protests like the June 3rd movement. Some even criticized it as a second USA treaty.
I see. So I guess they had no choice but to leave the clauses about claims rights vague.
Exactly. Looking back, the fact that we're re-examining this issue today was almost inevitable.
Oh, it sounds interesting.
So, do you guys think that Korea can continue to claim this right over Japan?
Well, Korea actually has already received compensation through the Treaty of 1965. And although there is no legal option of getting more compensation, I heard from the news that Korea got 1 billion yen more from Japan in 2017. Maybe continuing to claim could cause a lot of conflict, so I think it would be difficult.
It was a treaty between countries. There was no compensation for individuals.
That doesn't mean that Korea hasn't been compensated.
At first, the interpretation of the treaty is very ambiguous. The Korean Supreme Court has also ruled that only the claim between governments has been resolved, not the claim by individuals. There are many who believe that the right to claim is still valid.
That's just Korea's verdict. It has no effect on Japan. In the end, it's all political.
Why do you always say that it's all just politics? Isn't it true that the legal interpretation is ambiguous and that the victim should be compensated? Don't you think saying that is too much?
Wait, calm down. Don't be so
And even if the legal interpretation is ambiguous, continuing to claim for what we've already been compensated will have a negative effect on our diplomatic position.
Of course, diplomatic benefits are important, but the stance of the victims is more important in this case. Wrapping up the problem without fully discussing it with the victims is the same as ignoring them. How can a crime be forgiven by a country and not by the victims?
Okay, so let me clear it up. Haman is emphasizing the importance of diplomatic relations and benefits, and Hajo is emphasizing the justice that needs to be settled for the victims. I think both aspects are important. The victim's position is surely important, but the diplomatic ties with Japan are also extremely important.
Alright. I agree that understanding the victim's situation is necessary, but could you explain a little bit more?
So maybe the fundamental reason for the victims to continue to claim for their compensation is to get authentic apologies from the Japanese government and the war criminal enterprises.
Yeah, the victims just want sincere apologies. People say that Japan has been apologizing consistently, but there has never been an official acknowledgement of the crime and apology from the government of Japan.
Then what kind of apologies were there?
There were many expressions of regret from politicians, including the Prime Minister. It's just that their comments weren't the government's official stance.
Anyways, we got compensation and apologies, didn't we?
These apologies had no authenticity.
What do you mean by authenticity? How can a state have authenticity? A state is a group that has sovereignty, is not an individual. How does a state have authenticity make sense?
In this context, authenticity means consistent acknowledgement. Throughout history, Japan has shown contradicting statements while also distorting certain parts of history, showing disrespect.
Consistent acknowledgement? In the Kono statement, the Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japan admitted and acknowledged that the use of Korean comfort women was actually established by the government. The Japanese military was deeply engaged in it, and the abuse was done against the women's wills, and they apologized for that. Why must they continue to apologize then?
Because, in a certain point of view, these statements were made by individuals, and no official apology was issued by the state of Japan, and they left scars on the nation that can't be washed away.
Yeah, but there were apologies.
We have to remember that every country behaves in a way that will benefit the nation. After all, the criminals themselves are almost all dead now. Then why should the government of Japan apologize now?
Let me give you an example. Germany has consistently apologized and shown remorse for the crimes of the Holocaust and Nazi fascism since World War II ended. Shouldn't Japan show the same attitude as Germany?
It was intended for political purposes. We don't have time to explain that, but as I said, a country can't have true authenticity.
But at least they can pretend to have morals. Isn't it still advisable to behave like Germany?
Of course, moral debates could define what the right attitude is, but it needs to be understood in the context of the country's political interests. In this case, continuing to demand compensation from Japan would further harm the already iffy relationship between Korea and Japan.
That was the reason for Germany to use remorse as a political device.
Germany had someone to clearly blame for war crimes, and the neighboring countries were all powerful nations, so it was better for Germany to apologize. In conclusion, both Japan and Germany's authenticity is only a political device.
If it's just a problem of compensation, then can't they receive it through someone else?
Through someone else? How?
The government of Korea settled a bill named Third-Party Reimbursement Proposals in 2023. It was to compensate the victims through those who benefited after the treaty, such as the government and companies.
There actually was a discussion that the Japanese government established private organizations to embed these compensation plans.
How did it go?
Well, most of them were rejected. The victims wanted a direct apology and reparations from the Japanese government.
See, it's not just a problem of monetary compensation. The priority is to get an apology. It's about historical justice, not money. Don't think it's all about money.
In the end, there's no way to satisfy the victims unless the government releases an official statement along with official compensation. However, since so much time has passed and there are not that many survivors left, it is more realistic for them to just receive the apologies and compensation from the third party.
But Korean courts have already concluded that the Japanese government should compensate the victims. So the third-party reimbursement is the opposite of what the Korean courts demanded, and it's a decision that will only diminish the prestige of our judiciary in Korea.
So eventually, the third-party reimbursement is also not a perfect solution.
Apparently, this debate was so heated that it never seemed to cool down.
True, we could probably debate on it for like 3 more days.
Well, we can't do a podcast for 3 days though. Let's wrap it up.
Yeah.
I think the reason why this debate is never going to be concluded is because both sides are justified and we can't also lose those two claims.
That's right. Historical justification is important and diplomatic utility also cannot be overlooked.
In the future, I think we should continue to discuss other tangled history topics and political controversies, not just this issue.
Debate can play an important role in laying the foundations for a healthy democratic society.
We also need to broaden our horizons by listening to many other perspectives, by exercising our rights of freedom of thought and expression.
Exactly. It is likely that many of our listeners have been thinking about this issue while listening to our podcast. I'll be so glad if our podcast has given listeners an opportunity to think about this issue and come to their own conclusions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, see you all next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.